Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this great event for inviting me to be part of this auspicious occasion. The topic given to me by the organizers basically it's on the legal requirements, and I'm glad that our leading scholars have actually spoken on aspects of the Sharia, the contractual aspects, and what we are supposed to actually do, looking at the current AOF standards and what we can actually learn from it, because these are general rules established by the Sharia. And once you talk about digital Islamic banks, you just talk about application of those existing standard rules. Now we want to look at the legal requirements, particularly licensing. How do you establish a digital Islamic bank? These are some of the core issues we need to look into. Yes, we had a presentation on Insha in Germany, the first, digital Islamic bank in Germany, and there's another one, MIM, in Bahrain, established by the Gulf International Bank. Now, these are digital Islamic banks emerging, so we are no longer looking at the future. We're talking about what you have now. So we need to encourage more Islamic banks to actually join this and establish these banks. Then I'll give a differentiation between what you call the neobanks and the new banks, because you have two different types of digital Islamic banks from the licensing perspective, from the regulatory perspective. The first type, before I move on to the opening thoughts, actually talk about Islamic banks or digital Islamic banks established by existing Islamic banks, and that's what you have in Shura as well as MIM. They were established by existing banks, so they do not necessarily need a separate license, basically, except for aspects relating to their cybersecurity. You have the fit and proper criteria established by the EU, and all these were part of the things considered for Shura in terms of its establishment. Now, you have what you call the new digital banks, the new one, NEO. These are actually banks that started as startups and later went ahead to actually get what you call the license of a bank. I'll come back to that later. Now, generally, I'm going to skip the opening thoughts. One way or the other, we've all gone through different issues with our banks. I mean, the conventional banks, we have the Islamic banks. I mean, issues involving your withdrawals, your balance statement. These are things we do have. Now, how do we move away from there and try to actually embrace the new bandwagon of digital Islamic banks by actually trying to solve those problems? Now, if Islamic banks fail, if they fail to actually move towards the new model of digital Islamic banks, what we're going to face in maybe in the year 2030 is you're not going to have many bankers working again, because everything will be taken over by conventional banks. Algorithms will take over your jobs as bankers. So how do we actually prevent these and also ensure that whatever we are having is Sharia compliant? And this is where the role of the scholars come in. And that's why I'm glad they've been able to establish what we need to do in terms of Sharia compliance. This is a fundamental part of any digital Islamic banks. Now, disrupting the banking industry actually requires Islamic banks themselves to actually go for licenses and obtain digital Islamic bank license. And again, the question you're going to ask me is whether there are regulations for digital Islamic banks, particularly in the Muslim world. I will say we don't have this as of now. This is why, finally, I'll be proposing that some of the standard setting institutions like AOF and IFSB may have to come up with some of the fit and proper criteria in terms of what a digital Islamic bank should have, before, the Europeans, because the EU actually has a standard framework. So I guess we need a similar framework that is Sharia compliant within the Muslim world. I'll come back to some of the peculiarities or specifics we have to actually focus on later. Now, looking at what I said initially, why we need to proceed to get licenses, I mean Islamic banks. You see, branches have closed up in the United States, starting from the global financial crisis in 2008 up to 2016. Now you have how many banks? 95,018 banks closing within that period. When I say branches, I mean branches of banks, because they have to actually change to electronic banking. Now we are moving from electronic banking to digital banking itself. So this is where the legal framework actually starts from licensing. So if we don't have a framework for licensing of this kind of banks, then we might not be going anywhere. But again, what we have in the EU, which I'm going to share with you, actually it's similar to what we have in the Muslim world as well. there is no special licensing framework except for aspect of cybersecurity and specific aspects. Shura compliance, actually, you're expected to do it yourself, particularly in Europe and the UK. It's not something the regulator will insist on. Now, these are opportunities for the Muslim world, particularly the standard setting bodies, to actually tap into in setting prudential standards as well as Shura compliance standards to actually drive this industry. Now, basically, licenses required from regulator. To be called a bank, you need a license. So to be called a digital bank, as we earlier said, you also need a license. So we have different practices. In the industry, in the UK, they call them challenger banks because they are challenging and disrupting the conventional system. Now you have a number of digital banks across the world, and at the moment we have 2 Shura compliant digital banks. Now I'll skip this aspect of the difference between the electronic banking and the digital banking, and I guess some of the scholars have spoken about this earlier, and you can read up this part in the paper. Fundamentally, I guess I'll spend some time here on this slide because now the first part actually talks about the European Union part, where the applicant for a digital bank license will start actually with the National Competent Authority, the NCA. The NCA will actually give the initial draft of the approval, whether they approve it or not, before it proceeds to go to the ECB, the European Central Bank. Now, the European Central Bank doesn't have the final say because it still needs to proceed to the supervisory board. And ultimately, the Governing Council of the European Union actually will approve this. The European Central Bank will approve the license. Now, how do we plug in the Sharia compliance part? If you talk about digital Islamic banks, must they follow the same framework? And I'm sure Insha actually got their license under this EU framework. But they ensured internal Sharia compliance by getting a compliance certificate, which was displayed to us a while ago. This is very important. So it's more of an internal Sharia assurance. This is what is required, in such jurisdiction. But I guess in a jurisdiction like Qatar and the GCC generally, I guess we may have a regulator-imposed Sharia governance framework. This is where the regulators may have to come up if they have to license some of these banks in the region. This is why we're proposing in terms of a Sharia governance framework, which will not be different from what you have at the moment. The current framework, as some of the leading scholars have said, it's okay. The scholars actually can issue a fatwa based on the current framework. Then you talk about AOFI standards and IFSB standards. This will be actually relevant for cross-border transactions. When you talk about digital Islamic banks, they are purely cross-border thing. It's not mainly just a retail thing within a country. So you'll be talking about cross-border transactions all the time. You may be traveling and you may want to actually transact or even get some money from your bank. So this is where the cross-border regulatory part is important. Now, finally, this slide, I guess, is very important in terms of looking at what a typical digital Islamic bank should have. Licensing is very important. As I mentioned earlier, we talked about NEO, N-E-W, and NEO, N-E-O, in terms of the type of bank. So if you want to license this kind of bank, you have to determine what kind of bank it is. Who is actually issuing the license? So is it a new startup or an existing bank? So that's number one. So I'll just end with this last thing in terms of Sharia governance, which we have mentioned on one part. Cybersecurity has been actually mentioned as well. Dispute resolution has to be in real time from your phone or your Apple Watch or your wristwatch. Immediately, you must be able to settle things with the bank. And finally, we talk about standard setting bodies. So these are some of the things we feel a typical digital Islamic bank regulatory framework should have. So if regulatory bodies across the world, particularly in the Muslim world, are considering establishing this. So these are some of the things we feel they should focus on. And these are some of the conclusions we arrive at based on what I have explained earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.